everyone! Today we're going to be going over supporting material in oral citations for your speeches, Module 6. I'm breaking this lecture up into two parts. The first is citing sources and supporting material, and then the second part will be oral citations, what you need to be doing in your speeches. So first, starting off with supporting material. So we have different types of supporting material out there. We have primary sources, secondary sources, and these can come from examples which you often find online sometimes. If you find an example of something in your speech or an example of something that's going on right then and there. These can be metaphors as well. They can also be, for example, if you were to do a speech about flooding in Lubbock, you would talk about different parts of campus, an example of parts of campus that flood. These can be used in your speeches, and these would be great to use in your speeches because this allows for audience analysis or the audience to pay attention to what you're saying. Another type of supporting material are narratives or stories told. This is something that's just passed down, oral tradition. Narratives, just make sure when you're doing these in any type of speech that you're not spending too long on them. They don't want to overtake your speech altogether unless your speech is the narrative. Make sure that when you are telling a narrative that it follows in line with organizing and keeping your speech limited to or your narrative limited to the time you would allocate for most subpoints under that area. Especially for this class, since we have such short speeches, you're not giving a long presentation. I would avoid narratives as much as possible. But another thing you can have as support material is a testimony. So someone's own account of what happened. Facts, these are primary sources oftentimes, or secondary sources. Facts can be a fact of what has happened, but that's more of a testimony. More like if you find something online, the sky is blue, that's a fact. This is something that doesn't necessarily have to be cited, but a fact that most people don't know or is not common knowledge needs to be cited. If you aren't sure if it's common knowledge or not, it doesn't hurt you to cite it. But statistics is also a good form of supporting material. Statistics are data that's collected or data that has been found that present your case. So think numbers when you think statistics. So good forms of credible sources. You need to be critical consumers of online information. Whenever you see any type of citation, ask yourself, who posted this information and why? It's not just about is the information itself credible, but is the person who's posting it credible? That's usually where you want to go first. Is it a blog? Are you pulling from a blog? You can, but the person that is informing you on the blog needs to be credible. So say someone has a doctorate in, financial planning, for example. If you have a doctorate in financial planning and you're writing on a blog about research, that's definitely a credible source. But you also have to think, if this financial planner is talking about intercultural or interpersonal communication and they have their doctorate in financial planning, does that make them a credible source if they're posting it on the blog? So think about who is posting it, but also why are they posting it, which is really important. If you find yourself doing any type of research and you're citing a website and there's not anyone that has taken credit as author or there's no author on that page, I would assume it's not published work. People can go in and type up anything they want on a website, but if it doesn't have an author and date, then it's probably not published work. So avoid using things that are not published, especially when you're using websites online. Now, if you're using a website that's pulling from articles or an article itself that is published, like the New York Times, for example, or the Washington Post, these are different examples of websites that will have an author and are published. Do they have a bias though? Think about it. If you look online and you just Google news sources and biased news sources, you can pull up diagrams that have, right-wing policies, right-wing sites, and you have left-wing sites, and then you have your centrist area. These are the sites that you should be pulling from when you're researching. You should not have one site over the other. If you do, and it's contradictory, and you're doing like a persuasive speech, for example, or you're in a debate, if you pull from Fox News, then you should probably also pull from CNN, just to balance it out and make sure to have the most centrist view with your research, not just what you're saying, but with your research as possible. Think about the source qualifications, and that kind of goes back to, has it been published? If you can't find an author, it probably hasn't been published, which means it is not credible work. So don't take in things that you can't find an author. You can't find author credentials. If you Google the author and you can't find any type of credentials that make the information important, then don't go with that source. Move on and find a different source. Just because someone said it at one time doesn't mean that it's correct. So make sure you're a critical consumer of online information, especially now when we have so many people just saying whatever they want. Is there similar information found? That's another thing too. If you can't find an author for the work that you have just found on a website, take the paragraph or take a sentence or two about what they're talking about and Google it. Because oftentimes people that don't publish online are just directly pulling from other sources. So if you find something that you don't have a credible source for, Google it and see if you can find a credible source with that information. That means the information is probably correct. It's just not going to be cited correct if you use it from that blog. Try to locate the information in at least 3 other credible places. Is this information timely? That's if you're talking about statistics about what's happening now. For example, the US economy is really high. Well, it's not, but I'm sure you could find an article or two from a couple years ago where that does say the US economy is really high. So make sure that you're finding information that apply to the right here and now. If you're finding old information, but there's newer information that contradicts what you're saying, then it's probably not good information. So make sure that you're paying attention to when was it published. And if there isn't any new information out there and it's from 1990, it's still a credible source because that's the latest information that was found. So don't discount old sources, but also at the same time, make sure that you have the latest postings of that research and the latest findings of that research. So we have 2 different types of sources. As we've learned throughout school since, probably middle school, we have our primary sources and our secondary sources. I'm going to breeze through this a little bit quicker than the rest of the lecture because I think we know the difference between primary and secondary sources. Primary sources provide the first-hand account or direct evidence. We find this in digital collections, personal knowledge and experience. If you were there, can you explain what happened when you were there? That would be your first-hand account. We'll have a lot of first-hand accounts with the introductory speech. Interviews you conduct, surveys you conduct. We're not going to be using interviews you conduct. Well, interviews maybe, but surveys you conduct, unless it is published, I would not use this in any type of speech or presentation unless you're presenting at like a conference or you're presenting something that you mass data collected. Secondary sources provide analysis or commentary, not directly observed or created. Books, newspaper, periodicals, government publications. Reference sources, encyclopedias, that's definitely one. Internet sources, blogs, social news sites. These are all examples of secondary sources. Your textbooks in most classes are secondary sources. Unless they're an autobiography, they're secondary sources. They're pulling from primary sources, but you're quoting the secondary source. All right. So that's it for our sources. Think about this, because remember, it's an efficacy question if you are not using, you're thinking critical about the online sources that you're pulling from. But also, I want you to think of it as your ethos. If you're pulling from bad sources or you don't have good credentials on your sources, then your ethos is going to decrease and people are going to stop listening to your speech. Remember, we want that 100% audience analysis. And so, in order to get that 100%, we need to make sure we have good sources. And when we're citing them, cite them correctly and ethically.